Elon Musk saves Donald Trump from shooter. What happens next is shocking. The stadium was alive with energy, a mix of electric anticipation and heated tension, as a crowd of thousands gathered under the blistering midday sun. American flags waved in the air, the music of patriotic anthems blared over the loudspeakers, and a sea of red hats dotted the crowd like a uniform of allegiance. At the center of the stage stood the towering figure of Donald Trump, his iconic red tie fluttering in the breeze as he addressed the roaring audience. Behind him, a line of stern-faced security agents scanned the crowd, their earpieces buzzing as they monitored the controlled chaos. Trump's voice boomed through the speakers, a blend of bravado and calculated rhetoric. "We are here today to take back what is ours," he declared, his gestures sweeping wide to emphasize his words. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices blending into a single roar that echoed off the concrete walls of the stadium. But amid the cheers, a different kind of energy began to brew, one that didn't belong to the celebration. In the shadows of the farthest stands, a man in a black hoodie shifted uncomfortably. His face was obscured, but his body language betrayed him, nervous, fidgety, constantly glancing toward the stage. In his hands, he clutched a suspiciously oversized duffel bag, his fingers tightening around the straps as his gaze flickered to the security agents stationed at the edge of the stage. No one around him seemed to notice, their attention fixed on the spectacle at the podium. Near the front row, another man adjusted his tie and glanced over his shoulder. Elon Musk stood apart from the crowd, his polished appearance and calm demeanor a stark contrast to the boisterous energy around him. He wasn't supposed to be there, his presence wasn't announced, and no one had expected the billionaire to show up at a political rally, least of all Trump's. Yet here he was, blending in with the sea of suits and security agents near the stage, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that suggested he wasn't just there to spectate. On stage, Trump's speech continued uninterrupted, his voice growing louder as he leaned into the microphone. "They want us to be afraid," he said, his tone conspiratorial. "But we're not afraid, are we?" The crowd roared back, "No." In the midst of the noise, the man in the hoodie took a shaky breath and unzipped the duffel bag. Inside, the unmistakable glint of metal caught the sunlight. His hands trembled as he reached inside, his movements quick and deliberate. He glanced around again, his hood casting a shadow over his face, before pulling the weapon free. A semi-automatic rifle emerged from the bag, its black barrel gleaming under the stadium lights. Elon caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. His body stiffened, his instincts kicking in immediately. He didn't know who the man was or why he was there, but the weapon in his hands was impossible to ignore. Without hesitation, Elon stepped closer to the stage, his sharp mind already calculating the best course of action. But he didn't act just yet. He couldn't, not without knowing the full scope of what was about to unfold. Meanwhile, the man with the rifle steadied himself, his eyes locked on the stage. He muttered something under his breath, the words lost in the cacophony of the crowd, before raising the weapon to his shoulder. His target was clear: Donald Trump, who stood at the podium, oblivious to the danger lurking in the stands. Up on the stage, one of the security agents noticed something unusual in the crowd. His hand flew to his earpiece, his voice a low murmur as he relayed his observations to the others. "Possible threat, northeast quadrant," he said, his tone clipped. "Black hoodie, rifle." Moving into position now, the other agents tensed, their eyes scanning the crowd as they moved into formation. One agent positioned himself closer to Trump, his hand hovering near his sidearm, while another began weaving through the crowd toward the suspected shooter. But the man in the hoodie was fast, his movements calculated. He ducked behind a row of seats, using the cheering crowd as cover, and began inching closer to the stage. Elon moved instinctively, his path deliberate but unassuming as he navigated through the throng of spectators. He wasn't sure if the security agents had seen the shooter yet, but he wasn't going to wait to find out. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with possibilities. Should he alert the security team? Confront the shooter himself? His gut told him there wasn't time for debate. The shooter raised the rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. His hands were steady now, his focus unshakable as he aimed at the man standing at the podium. Trump gestured animatedly, his voice rising as he delivered another line of his speech, completely unaware of the danger bearing down on him. Just as the shooter's finger began to squeeze the trigger, a sharp voice pierced the air. "Hey!" The single word was loud and commanding, cutting through the noise like a whip. The shooter flinched, his aim wavering as his head snapped toward the source of the voice. It was Elon. He stood a few rows away, his eyes locked onto the shooter with a cold intensity. "Put it down," he said, his voice firm but calm. "You don't want to do this." For a moment, the shooter hesitated, his grip on the rifle loosening slightly. But the moment passed quickly, and his resolve hardened once more. He raised the weapon again, this time with renewed determination. Elon's jaw tightened. His sharp eyes darted toward the security agents, who were now closing in but still several seconds too far to act. The crowd, oblivious to the drama unfolding, continued to cheer and chant, their voices drowning out the danger just feet away. Elon knew he had only one chance to stop this, and time was running out. The air seemed to shift in the stadium, a subtle but palpable change that only a few people near the stage noticed. Elon's sharp command had disrupted the shooter's rhythm, but the crowd, deafened by its own cheers, remained blissfully unaware of the danger lurking in their midst. The shooter's head snapped toward Elon, his eyes narrowing in irritation and panic as his grip on the rifle tightened. "Mind your own business," the man growled, his voice barely audible over the roar of the crowd. His hood slipped back slightly, revealing a face that was young but hardened, his jaw clenched with a kind of reckless determination that only came from someone with nothing to lose. Elon didn't back down. His expression remained calm, but his sharp eyes betrayed his calculation. Every move the man made, every twitch of his fingers, Elon noticed. He knew that one wrong word or sudden motion could turn this already volatile situation into a full-blown tragedy. "I'm making it my business," Elon said evenly, taking a small step closer. His tone was quiet, but there was an authority to it that cut through the noise. "You don't want to do this. Whatever you think this will solve, it won't." The shooter's gaze flicked back to the stage, where Trump was still speaking, his voice rising and falling in rhythm with the crowd's cheers. The man's finger hovered over the trigger again, his hands steadying as he recalibrated his aim. Elon acted quickly. "Do you even know what happens after you pull that trigger?" he asked, his voice sharp enough to slice through the man's concentration. "You think you're the one making a statement? You're not. You'll just be the scapegoat, the excuse they need to make everything worse." The shooter hesitated again, his head turning slightly toward Elon. For a moment, it seemed like the man was considering his words. But then his jaw tightened, and he shook his head as if to clear it. "Shut up," he muttered. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you think this will make a difference," Elon replied, his voice unwavering. "But it won't. You'll be the headline for a week, maybe two. And after that, you'll be forgotten. A footnote. While everyone else will still be here, dealing with the fallout of what you did." From the corner of his eye, Elon noticed the security agents moving closer, their faces tense and their hands hovering near their weapons. They were trying to remain discreet, their movements slow to avoid alarming the crowd or spooking the shooter, but they weren't moving fast enough. If the shooter noticed them before they could get close, it could all be over in seconds. The man's hand trembled slightly on the rifle, a flicker of doubt creeping into his expression. But his resolve returned just as quickly, his eyes hardening as he pointed the weapon back at the stage. "He deserves this," the shooter said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "They all do." Elon stepped closer, his movements deliberate but calm. "Maybe he does," he said, his tone shifting slightly. It was a calculated gamble, but Elon knew he had to meet the man where he was, to speak his language if he had any chance of de-escalating the situation. "But is this really how you want to go out? As the guy who couldn't think of a better way to fight back?" The shooter's grip on the rifle tightened, but his expression wavered. "I'm doing this for everyone," he muttered, his voice cracking slightly. "Someone has to." Someone has to what? Elon pressed. Take a shot at a man on a stage? You think that makes you a hero? It doesn't. It makes you a statistic. The people you think you're doing this for, they'll just be left to clean up the mess while you're gone. And nothing changes. The man's breathing grew heavier, his chest rising and falling as the weight of Elon's words pressed against his resolve. For the first time, he seemed to falter, his focus shifting from the stage to the crowd around him. People were starting to notice the tension now, their cheers growing quieter as heads turned and whispers spread. "Hey!" A voice called from the row behind the shooter. It was a middle-aged man in a red baseball cap, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on over there?" "Stay out of this," the shooter snapped, his voice rising. He adjusted his stance, the barrel of the rifle tilting slightly as he glanced over his shoulder. The man in the cap raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, his face pale as he backed away. The commotion drew more attention, and the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People began shifting uneasily, their eyes darting between the stage and the unfolding drama in the stands. On the stage, Trump seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere. He paused mid-sentence, his gaze sweeping over the crowd as he tried to discern the source of the disturbance. "Security," Trump said, his voice amplified by the microphone. "What's going on out there?" The agents on stage moved quickly, their hands flying to their earpieces as they scanned the crowd. One of them stepped closer to Trump, leaning in to whisper in his ear. Trump's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he nodded sharply. "Get it under control," he said, his voice clipped. The shooter's head snapped toward the stage, his eyes wide with panic as he realized he was losing control of the situation. "Shut up," he shouted, his voice cracking as he raised the rifle again. "Everyone just shut up." The crowd erupted in chaos, people scrambling to move away as the shooter's voice echoed through the stadium. Elon seized the moment, stepping closer while the man's attention was distracted. His heart pounded in his chest, but his voice remained calm as he spoke again. "Think about this," Elon said, his tone low and urgent. "You can still walk away. Right now, you're in control. But the second you pull that trigger, you lose everything." The shooter's eyes darted to Elon, his hands shaking as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. For a split second, it seemed like he might lower the weapon. The stadium had descended into a cacophony of chaos. The cheerful chants and applause of just moments ago had turned into panicked whispers and cries of alarm as people began to realize something was very, very wrong. The shooter, rifle in hand, jerked his head from side to side, trying to maintain control of the spiraling situation. His breathing was erratic now, his panic barely concealed beneath the mask of determination he clung to. "Stay back," he barked, his voice cracking as he pointed the weapon toward the nearest group of people. A ripple of fear spread through the crowd as those closest to him ducked or scrambled for cover, leaving a widening circle of empty seats around him. The shooter's hands trembled, and beads of sweat dripped down his temple. He was losing control, and he knew it. Elon's voice cut through the noise again, calm and deliberate despite the growing tension. "You don't want to do this," he said, taking another measured step closer. His body language was steady, his movements calculated, but his mind was racing. He knew the man was on the edge, and any wrong move could send him over it. "Shut up," the shooter snapped, swinging the barrel of the rifle toward Elon. His hands were shaking so badly now that the weapon wavered in his grip, the muzzle pointing wildly as his emotions took over. "You think you can talk me down? You don't know what it's like." "None of you do." Elon held up his hands in a placating gesture, his eyes locked on the shooter's. "You're right," he said evenly. "I don't know what it's like to be you. I don't know what brought you here or why you think this is the only way. But I do know this. Pulling that trigger doesn't fix anything. It just ends things, your life, his life, everything." The shooter's jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the rifle tighter. "Don't try to act like you care," he spat. "You're just another one of them. Rich, powerful, untouchable. You don't understand what it's like to have no way out." "I understand more than you think," Elon countered, his tone steady but insistent. "But you're wrong about one thing. I'm not untouchable. I'm standing right here in front of you because I believe you can stop this before it's too late. The man's eyes flickered with doubt for a brief moment, but the panic and anger quickly returned. Too late, he said with a bitter laugh. It's already too late. I've been invisible my whole life. No one listens. No one cares. At least this way, they'll notice. Elon took another step closer, his eyes never leaving the shooters. He was close now, too close for comfort, but just close enough to keep the man's focus entirely on him. You think this is how they'll notice you? Elon said, his voice sharp. You think this makes you strong? It doesn't. It makes you a pawn in someone else's game. What the hell do you know about it? The shooter snapped, his voice rising. You've never had to fight for anything. You've never been powerless. You're just another rich guy who thinks he can talk his way out of anything. I'm not trying to talk my way out of anything, Elon replied, his voice firm. I'm trying to talk you out of making the biggest mistake of your life. The shooter's hands trembled again, his grip faltering slightly as his breathing grew heavier. His eyes darted between Elon and the stage, where Trump was now flanked by several security agents. The agents were moving cautiously, their eyes locked on the shooter, their weapons at the ready. One of them raised a hand, signaling to another agent on the far side of the stadium. Elon noticed the movement out of the corner of his eye and knew time was running out. The shooter's panic was increasing by the second, and the agents were closing in. If they made a move too soon, the situation could explode into violence. Elon had to keep the man's attention on him and off the stage, long enough for the agents to act. You said no one listens, Elon said, his tone softening slightly. But I'm listening. Right now, I'm listening to you. You don't need to do this to be heard. The shooter let out a shaky breath, his gaze flickering toward Elon again. It doesn't matter, he muttered. None of it matters. People like him, they don't care about us. They never will. Then make them care another way, Elon urged, his voice low and urgent. Show them you're better than this. Show them you won't be the pawn they expect you to be. For a moment, it seemed like the man might lower the rifle. His hands loosened slightly on the grip, and the fire in his eyes dimmed just enough to give Elon a sliver of hope. But the moment passed quickly, and the man's resolve returned. He adjusted his stance, his finger tightening on the trigger as he turned back toward the stage. Get back, the shooter shouted, his voice cracking as he swung the rifle toward Elon again. The crowd screamed, the panic spreading like wildfire as people scrambled to get away. Security agents moved faster now, their hands on their weapons as they prepared to intervene. Elon stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest as he stared down the barrel of the rifle. The shooter's face was a mask of anger and fear, his body trembling with the weight of his own decisions. Elon knew he was out of time. Last warning, the shooter shouted, his voice breaking. His hands shook so violently that the rifle wavered again, but the determination in his eyes was unrelenting. And then, everything happened at once. Rows of seats emptied as people tripped over one another in their frantic rush to escape the unfolding chaos. Security agents, still trying to maintain order, shouted commands into their earpieces as they moved toward the shooter, their weapons drawn but their hands steady, waiting for the right moment to strike. The crowd's collective screams and shouts drowned out all but the most immediate sounds, a deafening symphony of fear. The shooter's trembling hands gripped the rifle tightly, his erratic movements betraying the storm of emotions raging inside him. His eyes darted between Elon, the encroaching security team, and the stage, where Trump stood shielded by a wall of agents. Yet, despite the chaos, the shooter remained rooted to the spot, his conviction warring with the panic etched across his face. Stay back, he screamed again, the rifle swinging wildly to emphasize his demand. The barrel wavered between Elon and the stage, his indecision written in every twitch of his body. His face was drenched in sweat now, his breathing ragged as the weight of the moment crushed down on him. Elon, standing impossibly calm in the chaos, raised his hands slightly. Listen to me, he said, his voice cutting through the noise with a clarity that seemed almost unnatural. This is your chance to stop. Right now. No one's hurt. You can still walk away. I said stay back, the shooter barked, his voice cracking as he took a shaky step backward. His foot caught on the edge of a seat, and for a moment he stumbled, his balance faltering. The rifle wavered in his hands, and Elon instinctively took a step forward. The shooter recovered quickly, his panic flashing into rage as he leveled the weapon at Elon. I told you to stay back, he snarled, his finger inching dangerously close to the trigger. Don't come any closer. Elon froze, his sharp eyes locked onto the man's trembling hands. His instincts screamed at him to act, to lunge forward and disarm the man, but he held himself back. The rifle was still too steady, the shooter's panic too unpredictable. One wrong move and it could all spiral out of control. Meanwhile, the security agents had closed the gap, moving in from multiple angles. Their movements were coordinated, their eyes locked on the shooter as they prepared to act. One of the agents, a burly man with a shaved head, gestured silently to another, his fingers flashing a quick series of signals. Elon caught the movement out of the corner of his eye and knew they were seconds away from making their move. But the shooter noticed too. His eyes darted to the approaching agents, and his panic spiked. Don't you dare, he shouted, his voice shrill and desperate. He swung the rifle toward them, the barrel shaking as his grip tightened. I'll do it. I swear I'll do it. The agents froze, their hands hovering near their sidearms. The lead agent, his voice calm but commanding, stepped forward slightly. Put the weapon down, he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. It's over. Don't make this worse. It's not over, the shooter screamed, his voice echoing across the now silent stadium. None of you get it. You don't know what it's like to be nothing, to have no one listen to you. This is the only way they'll hear me. You're wrong, Elon said sharply, his voice cutting through the man's tirade. This isn't the way. This isn't how you get people to listen. All this does is prove them right, that you're dangerous, that you can't be trusted. The shooter's gaze snapped back to Elon, his face contorted with a mix of fury and pain. What do you know about it? He spat, his voice trembling. You're just another billionaire, another part of the problem. Elon didn't flinch. Maybe I am, he said evenly. Maybe I've been part of the problem in ways I don't even realize. But this, what you're doing, it doesn't fix anything. It just gives them another reason to ignore you. The shooter's hands shook harder, the rifle dipping slightly as his resolve wavered. His lips trembled, and for a brief moment, his mask of anger slipped, revealing the fear and desperation beneath. I just wanted them to see me, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant murmurs of the crowd. Elon took a slow, deliberate step forward, his hands still raised. They see you, he said softly. I see you. But this isn't the way you want to be remembered. Let it go. Please. The shooter's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his grip on the rifle faltering. But just as it seemed like he might lower the weapon, one of the security agents moved a fraction too quickly, their boots scuffing against the concrete. The sound was small, almost imperceptible, but to the shooter it was a trigger. Stay back, he screamed, his voice breaking as he swung the rifle toward the agents. The sudden motion sent a ripple of panic through the crowd, and several people screamed, ducking behind seats or bolting for the exits. The agents froze, their hands hovering near their weapons, but they didn't draw. Yet, Elon's heart raced as he stepped forward again, his movements quick but controlled. He knew the window for de-escalation was closing rapidly, and the tension in the air was so thick it felt like the entire stadium was holding its breath. Look at me, he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Don't look at them. Look at me. The shooter hesitated, his head snapping toward Elon. His eyes were wild, his breathing labored. People shoved and tripped over one another in their desperate bid to escape, the exits quickly clogging with bottlenecks of bodies. The eerie wail of sirens in the distance hinted that the outside world was finally catching wind of the escalating situation. On the stage, the security agents surrounding Trump sprang into action. A secondary layer of bodyguards emerged seemingly out of nowhere, their black suits and earpieces blending seamlessly into the chaos as they formed a human shield around the former president. One of them grabbed Trump by the arm and began ushering him toward the reinforced podium, which had been designed with a hidden bulletproof barrier. Another agent quickly retrieved a large black case from under the stage, snapping it open to reveal a ballistic shield and an arsenal of non-lethal weaponry. "Deploy the containment protocols," one of the lead agents barked into his wrist mic. His voice was calm but clipped, his words slicing through the chatter of the team's communication network. "Secure POTUS. Crowd control units on standby. Shooter is priority target. No engagement unless fired upon." Meanwhile, Elon Musk remained in the stands, his unflinching focus still locked on the shooter. He knew the security team was trained for moments like this, their response drilled into perfection through countless simulations. But Elon also knew that protocols couldn't account for everything. The shooter wasn't just a threat, he was a desperate man with nothing to lose, and desperation had a way of breaking the rules. The shooter's face was a portrait of turmoil, his jaw tight and his eyes darting between the stage, the advancing agents, and Elon. The rifle wavered in his grip, but the tension in his posture betrayed that he was close, so close, to losing what little control he had left. "Stay back!" The shooter screamed again, his voice breaking. His hands trembled as he adjusted his grip, the barrel of the rifle dipping slightly before swinging back toward the stage. "I mean it. I'll do it." The lead security agent on stage raised his hand, signaling his team to hold position. Their weapons remained holstered for now, but their fingers hovered near the triggers, their eyes trained on every twitch of the shooter's movements. One of the agents, crouched low behind the podium, spoke urgently into his mic. "Sniper team, do you have eyes on the target?" A crackling response came through the earpiece. "Negative. Too many civilians in the line of fire. We're repositioning now." On the ground, Elon saw the shooter's panic growing with every second. The man was sweating profusely, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to process the chaos around him. The rifle in his hands seemed to grow heavier, his grip faltering as the weight of his decisions pressed down on him. "You're surrounded," Elon said, his voice cutting through the noise with a clarity that seemed almost impossible. He took a slow step closer, his movements measured and deliberate. "There's no way out of this if you pull that trigger. But if you put the gun down now, you can still walk away from this." "Shut up," the shooter shouted, his voice hoarse. He swung the rifle toward Elon, the barrel shaking as he struggled to maintain control. "You don't tell me what to do. You don't understand what it's like." "I understand more than you think," Elon replied, his tone steady but insistent. "I know what it's like to feel cornered, to feel like the world is stacked against you. But this isn't the answer. This only ends one way, and it's not the way you think." The shooter hesitated, his hands trembling as his resolve wavered. But just as it seemed like Elon might be getting through to him, one of the agents on the far side of the stadium made a misstep. His boot scuffed loudly against the concrete, the sound sharp and out of place in the chaotic symphony of the crowd. The shooter's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes widening in panic. "No!" he screamed, swinging the rifle wildly toward the advancing agents. "Don't come any closer. I'll do it." The agents froze, their hands hovering near their weapons. The lead agent, still crouched behind the podium, barked another command into his mic. "All units, hold position. Do not engage unless fired upon." Elon seized the moment. "Look at me," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. He took another step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Don't look at them. Look at me. This is between you and me." The shooter's gaze snapped back to Elon, his face twisted with a mix of anger and desperation. His breathing was ragged now, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the whirlwind of chaos around him. "Why do you care?" he spat, his voice cracking. "You don't even know me." "I care because I've been where you are," Elon said, his voice softening slightly. It was a calculated move, a gamble to connect with the man on some level. "I felt like the world was against me, like nothing I did mattered. But I didn't let it define me, and you don't have to let it define you either." The shooter's hands loosened slightly on the rifle, the barrel dipping ever so slightly. For a brief moment, it seemed like Elon's words were getting through to him. But just as the tension in the man's posture began to ease, a piercing voice from the crowd shattered the fragile moment. "Just shoot him already," someone shouted from the stands, their words echoing loudly above the din. The shooter's face twisted in rage, his grip tightening on the rifle as his panic transformed into fury. "Shut up," he screamed, his voice raw. "All of you, just shut up." Elon's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped closer, his voice rising to match the escalating chaos. "Don't listen to them," he said urgently. "Listen to me. You can still end this without anyone getting hurt." "Enough," he shouted, his voice hoarse and cracking. "This ends now." Elon didn't hesitate. His body moved before his mind could catch up, his long legs propelling him forward in a sprint. The world around him blurred, the screams of the crowd and the shouts of security agents fading into the background as his entire focus zeroed in on the shooter. The distance between them closed in an instant, and just as the man's finger began to tighten on the trigger, Elon launched himself forward. He hit the shooter with the full force of his momentum, his shoulder slamming into the man's side and sending both of them sprawling to the ground. The rifle clattered out of the shooter's hands, skidding across the concrete and coming to rest a few feet away. The impact knocked the wind out of both men, their bodies colliding in a chaotic tangle of limbs. The stadium erupted into chaos. Security agents surged forward, their movements sharp and coordinated as they swarmed the scene. 2 agents dove for the rifle, securing it before the shooter could make another move, while others trained their weapons on the man sprawled on the ground. The lead agent barked into his earpiece, his voice calm but urgent. "Shooter subdued. Weapons secured. Repeat. Weapons secured." Elon pushed himself up, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. His suit was rumpled, and his face was flushed, but his expression was steely as he turned to the shooter, who lay gasping on the ground. The man's hood had fallen back, revealing a face twisted with anger, fear, and disbelief. You ruined everything," the shooter spat, his voice shaking. His hands were pinned behind his back now, held firmly by 2 security agents as they cuffed him. This was supposed to matter. People were supposed to notice. Elon crouched down, his sharp eyes locking onto the man's. Despite the chaos around them, his voice was calm, almost quiet. "People noticed," he said, "but not in the way you wanted. They'll remember what you did here today, not as a hero, but as a man who let his anger control him. Is that really what you want your legacy to be?" The shooter's face crumpled, his rage giving way to despair as the weight of Elon's words sank in. "I just wanted them to listen," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I just wanted to matter." "You do matter," Elon said firmly, "but this isn't how you show it. You have a voice, you just need to learn how to use it the right way." The agents hoisted the shooter to his feet, their grips firm but not rough as they escorted him away. The man didn't resist, his head hanging low as the reality of his situation finally hit him. The crowd, still lingering at the edges of the stadium, watched in stunned silence as the shooter was led toward the waiting police vehicles outside. On the stage, Trump stepped out from behind the protective barrier, his face a mix of irritation and relief. He adjusted his tie, his movements sharp and deliberate as he surveyed the scene. "Unbelievable," he muttered, his voice carrying through the now quiet stadium. "Can't even have a speech without someone trying to ruin it." Elon rose to his feet, brushing off his suit as he turned toward the stage. His expression was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. As Trump gestured for him to come closer, Elon's gaze flicked toward the crowd, his jaw tightening as he considered what to say. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trump said, his voice booming through the microphone as he gestured toward Elon. "Let's give a round of applause to this brave man who just saved the day." The crowd erupted into cheers, their earlier panic forgotten as they celebrated Elon's intervention. But Elon barely noticed. His mind was still racing, replaying the events of the past few minutes in vivid detail. He stepped onto the stage, his movements deliberate as he approached the podium. Trump clapped him on the shoulder, his smile wide and practiced. "Elon Musk, everyone," he said, his tone filled with the kind of performative admiration that played well on camera. A true American hero, Elon met Trump's gaze, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the crowd's cheers washing over them like a wave. Then, Elon turned to the microphone, his voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced the noise almost instantly. "This isn't about being a hero," he said, his words cutting through the air with precision. "It's about remembering that we're all responsible for the world we live in. What happened here today didn't come out of nowhere. It's a symptom of a much bigger problem. And if we don't address that, it's only going to keep happening." The crowd murmured, their cheers fading into thoughtful silence as Elon's words sank in. Trump's smile faltered slightly, his expression shifting to one of mild discomfort as he glanced at the cameras filming every word. "We have a choice," Elon continued. "We can keep ignoring the anger and fear that drives people to do things like this. Or we can start listening, really listening, and finding ways to address the root causes. Because if we don't, moments like this won't just be rare. They'll become the norm." The stadium fell silent, the weight of Elon's words pressing down on everyone present. Even Trump, known for his quick comebacks and deflections, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. And in that silence, the message was clear. This wasn't just a moment to be celebrated. It was a wake-up call. The stadium seemed to exhale all at once as Elon stepped back from the microphone, his words hanging heavy in the tense, humid air. The crowd, now quiet and contemplative, shuffled uneasily as the weight of the moment settled on their shoulders. The flashing red and blue lights of police cars painted the edges of the stadium in eerie patterns, signaling that the law was finally here to take control. But just as the atmosphere began to shift from chaos to resolution, a sharp, deafening crack shattered the silence. Bang! The unmistakable sound of a gunshot echoed through the stadium, sending a fresh wave of panic rippling through the crowd. People screamed and ducked, some dropping to the ground, while others scrambled for cover. The security agents surrounding Trump sprang into action, their weapons drawn as they pushed him behind the podium and surrounded him in a tight, protective formation. On stage, Elon froze for a split second, his sharp eyes scanning the stands for the source of the gunfire. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline surging back as the fragile calm of the moment dissolved into chaos once again. "Shooter, northwest corner," one of the security agents barked into his earpiece, his voice sharp and urgent. The other agents responded instantly, their movements swift and precise as they began sweeping the area. The crowd surged toward the exits, the panic reignited as people screamed and shoved their way towards safety. Elon's gaze snapped to the northwest corner of the stands, where a commotion was unfolding. The shooter, cuffed and subdued just moments ago, was now struggling violently against the two agents escorting him. In the chaos, he had managed to break free for just long enough to grab a concealed handgun from one of the agents' holsters. The weapon was small but deadly, and the look in the shooter's eyes was one of pure desperation. "Don't come any closer," the shooter screamed, his voice cracking as he waved the gun wildly. His hands were shaking, his finger dangerously close to the trigger as he backed toward the edge of the stands. "I'll do it. I swear I'll do it." The agents moved cautiously, their own weapons drawn but not raised. "Drop the gun," one of them commanded, his voice firm but calm. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will. Put it down now. I've got nothing to lose," the shooter shouted, his voice shrill and desperate. His eyes darted wildly between the agents and the crowd, his panic escalating with every second. "None of you understand. This is all I've got left." On the stage, Elon watched the scene unfold with a mix of horror and frustration. The shooter's actions weren't just dangerous. They were a clear sign that he was spiraling out of control. Elon's instincts screamed at him to act, but he knew this wasn't his moment. The security team had the situation under control, or so he hoped. The shooter's back hit the railing at the edge of the stands, and for a moment he froze. His breath came in ragged gasps as he glanced over his shoulder at the drop below. The sheer drop seemed to give him pause, and for a brief second, it looked like he might reconsider. But then his gaze snapped back to the agents, and the flicker of hesitation disappeared. "You don't get it," he spat, his voice trembling. "You never got it. None of you ever listened." "I'm listening now," the lead agent said, his tone calm and steady. He took a cautious step forward, his hands outstretched in a placating gesture. "But I need you to put the gun down so we can talk. No one else needs to get hurt." The shooter's hand trembled, the gun dipping slightly as his resolve faltered. But just as the agent reached for him, the man let out a guttural scream and raised the weapon again. Before he could fire, a single, sharp report rang out. Crack. The shooter's body jolted as a sniper's bullet found its mark, striking the weapon in his hand and sending it flying from his grip. The force of the shot knocked him backward, and he teetered on the edge of the railing for a heart-stopping moment before the agents surged forward, grabbing him just in time to pull him back to safety. The crowd, now frozen in stunned silence, watched as the agents wrestled the shooter to the ground and cuffed him again. This time, they weren't taking any chances. One of them retrieved the handgun while another radioed for backup. "Suspect disarmed," the lead agent said into his earpiece, his voice sharp and clipped. "Transport is en route. Secure the area." As the agents hauled the shooter to his feet, his face was pale and twisted with a mix of rage and defeat. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a hollow look of realization. The fight was over and he had lost, completely and utterly. The shooter was led out of the stadium in shackles, flanked by a dozen security agents and police officers. The crowd, still shaken, watched in stunned silence as the man disappeared from view, the flashing lights of the waiting police cars casting long shadows on the stadium walls. On stage, Trump emerged from behind the podium, his expression a mix of irritation and relief. "Well," he said, his voice booming through the microphone, "I think it's safe to say that was a bit more excitement than we were expecting today." The crowd laughed nervously, their tension breaking slightly at his attempt to lighten the mood. But Elon wasn't laughing. His gaze remained fixed on the northwest corner of the stands, where the chaos had finally been subdued. His mind raced with thoughts of what could have happened, what almost happened, and the lingering question of what drove the shooter to such desperation. As the stadium slowly began to settle, Elon turned to the lead agent on stage. "Make sure he gets the help he needs," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This can't just be about punishment. If we don't figure out why this keeps happening, it's only going to get worse." The agent nodded, his expression grim. "We'll do what we can." Elon stepped back, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd one last time. The chaos had subsided, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air like a storm cloud. He knew this moment would stay with him and everyone else who had witnessed it for a long time to come. The shooter was gone, taken away in the back of a reinforced police van. The agents, thorough and methodical, had cleared the northwest corner, cordoning off the area for an investigation. Blood and broken pieces of a shattered weapon marked the spot where the sniper's bullet had struck. The weight of the event lingered like a shadow, heavy and undeniable. Elon stood near the podium, his sharp eyes scanning the remnants of the crowd. His suit was wrinkled, a faint streak of dust on one sleeve where he'd hit the ground earlier, but he didn't seem to notice. His expression was calm, but there was a storm behind his eyes, an intensity that only deepened the longer he stood there. Trump had returned to the podium, clearly eager to reassert control over the moment. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat, his voice booming through the microphone as he addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank each and every one of you for your courage and patience today," he said, his tone carrying its usual mix of bravado and theatricality. "And I want to give a special thanks to Elon Musk, who, as you all saw, stepped in at a critical moment. Let's give him another round of applause." The crowd responded dutifully, clapping and cheering, though the energy felt muted compared to earlier. Elon gave a small nod in acknowledgement but made no move to step forward. He didn't want the spotlight. Not now, not after everything that had happened. As Trump continued to speak, Elon turned to one of the lead security agents, his voice low and measured. "Do you know where they're taking him?" he asked, referring to the shooter. "Local detention center," the agent replied. "Standard protocol for processing and initial questioning. After that, it's up to the prosecutors." Elon frowned slightly. "And then what?" he asked. "You'll lock him away and forget about him? Pretend like this was an isolated incident?" The agent hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. "We'll follow procedure," he said carefully. "That's all I can say for now." Elon nodded, though the answer didn't satisfy him. He turned his gaze back to the crowd, his thoughts racing. The man's desperation, his cries of invisibility. It was all too familiar. This wasn't the first time Elon had seen someone lash out, driven by a sense of powerlessness and anger, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Trump, meanwhile, was still in full performance mode, his voice rising and falling as he addressed the crowd. "What we saw here today was a reminder of why we must remain strong, united, and vigilant," he declared. "There are people out there who want to tear us down, who want to see us fail. But we won't let them, will we?" The crowd erupted in cheers, their earlier fear replaced by a rallying cry. But Elon barely heard it. His focus was elsewhere, on the cracks in the system that had led to this moment, on the people who had slipped through those cracks, and on the realization that something needed to change. As Trump stepped away from the podium, his security detail closing ranks around him, Elon took a step forward. He didn't need a microphone. His voice, sharp and clear, carried across the stadium as he addressed the crowd. "What happened today wasn't just about one man," he said, his tone calm but firm. The murmurs in the crowd quieted as people turned to listen. It was about something much bigger, a system that leaves people behind, that ignores their pain until it boils over into moments like this. The crowd was silent now, their eyes fixed on him. Elon continued, his voice steady. "We can't keep pretending that this is normal. We can't keep waiting for the next tragedy to remind us that something is wrong. If we want things to change, we have to start listening to each other, to the people who feel like they have no voice. And we have to take action." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, no one spoke, the crowd seemingly unsure of how to respond. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began to spread, growing louder and more sustained as people took in the weight of his message. Elon stepped back, his expression unreadable as he watched the crowd. He wasn't looking for validation. He didn't care about the applause. He cared about whether those words would stick, whether they would spark even the smallest shift in the way people thought about the world and their place in it. As the applause continued, he turned to leave, his steps purposeful as he made his way toward the exit. One of Trump's aides approached him, their expression a mix of admiration and curiosity. "Mr. Musk," they said, "that was quite a speech. Maybe you should consider running for office." Elon gave them a faint, wry smile but said nothing as he continued walking. He had no interest in politics, at least not in the traditional sense. His focus was on solutions, on building something better than the broken systems he saw around him. And that work, he knew, was far from over. As he stepped out of the stadium and into the night, the cool air hit his face, and he took a deep breath. The flashing lights of police cars lit up the street, and reporters swarmed the perimeter, their cameras trained on the exits as they shouted questions into the void. Elon ignored them, his mind already turning to what came next. The shooter's face lingered in his thoughts, a reminder of the countless others who felt like they had no way out. He couldn't save everyone, but maybe, just maybe, he could do something to prevent the next person from reaching that breaking point. And with that, he disappeared into the night, leaving behind a stadium full of people who would never forget what they had witnessed.